I always say that I never sang any style of music that I hadn't heard in my household growing up. I can't approach it with any kind of authenticity.
There is something quietly powerful about a woman who spent decades being underestimated, overlooked, and openly disrespected by some of the most famous names in rock and roll, and yet never once lost her composure in public. Linda Ronstadt built one of the most extraordinary careers in American music history not just through the sheer force of her voice, but through a kind of steely dignity that most people in the entertainment industry never managed to develop. She won Grammy Awards across multiple genres. She sold tens of millions of records. She filled arenas at a time when female solo artists were still being told to smile more and argue less. And through all of it, she kept her private frustrations exactly where she preferred them, private. But history has a way of surfacing what people try to bury. Over the years, through candid interviews, authorized biographies, accounts from producers and bandmates, and Ronstadt's own memoir, the full picture of her career has slowly come into focus. And that picture includes some genuinely stunning moments of disrespect, betrayal, and professional cruelty directed at one of the most talented singers this country has ever produced. Some of these stories involve musicians whose careers she personally helped launch. Others involve artists who publicly mocked her. A few involve collaborations that collapsed so badly they were never spoken of again. This is not a story about bitterness. Linda Ronstadt, now 78, does not come across as a bitter woman. If anything, she comes across as someone who processed her grievances with remarkable clarity and simply moved forward. But that doesn't mean the wounds weren't real. What follows is a look at 7 musicians whose relationships with Ronstadt left lasting marks, on her career, on her confidence, and on the way she chose to navigate an industry that was never particularly kind to women who refused to be managed. Long before Don Henley was filling stadiums with anthems about life in the fast lane, he was an unknown drummer from Texas trying to find his footing in Los Angeles. The music industry in 1971 was not especially welcoming to unknowns, no matter how talented they were. What changed everything for Henley, and for Glenn Frey, Randy Meisner, and Bernie Leadon, was a phone call that led them to Linda Ronstadt. Ronstadt was already a rising name in the California country rock scene when she decided to hire Henley and Frey as part of her touring band. She needed musicians who could hold their own on the road, and she gave 2 relative unknowns a chance that most established artists would not have offered. Henley played drums. Frey played guitar. Together, they learned the mechanics of professional touring, the discipline of stage performance, and perhaps most importantly, the vocal architecture that made Ronstadt sound so distinctive. Glenn Frey later acknowledged that watching Ronstadt record vocals taught them the true value of harmony, something that would go on to define the Eagles' sound for the next decade. When Frey and Henley decided to form their own group at the end of that tour, Ronstadt didn't stand in their way. She didn't try to hold on to musicians she had helped shape. According to multiple accounts from people close to her at the time, she actively encouraged industry contacts to pay attention to the new group. She was, in every meaningful sense, one of the founding conditions that made the Eagles possible. What she received in return was something considerably less generous. As the Eagles grew into one of the biggest acts in rock history, Henley's public attitude toward Ronstadt shifted. He became dismissive of her musical approach, suggesting in interviews that her style was too polished and too safe. Remarkable criticism coming from a man whose own early sound was shaped by her touring environment. The comment stung not because Ronstadt was unfamiliar with criticism, but because it came from someone who understood exactly how much she had contributed to his early development. The more serious rupture came when Ronstadt discovered that Henley had been using her name to access venues and events she was headlining, without her knowledge or consent. When she confirmed what had happened, she quietly revoked his backstage credentials and closed the door. No press release. No public confrontation. Just a firm, permanent line. People in the industry who knew both artists said that Ronstadt handled it exactly the way she handled most professional betrayals, with silence and finality. By the late 1960s, Jim Morrison had already become something of a myth, a poet, a provocateur, and a man who seemed constitutionally incapable of behaving professionally in any situation. His performances with the Doors were electric and genuinely dangerous in ways that went beyond music. Morrison's relationship with substance abuse was worsening rapidly during this period, and his behavior at concerts had become increasingly erratic. Most people in the industry knew it. Most tolerated it because the records kept selling. Linda Ronstadt encountered Morrison during a period when she was still establishing herself. The Stone Ponies had given her a moment of visibility with Different Drum, and she was working to build on that momentum into a sustainable solo career. During a concert where she was performing as the opening act, Morrison walked onstage mid-performance, approached her without warning, and attempted to kiss her in front of the audience. It was not playful. It was not consensual. It was the kind of behavior that, in any other professional context, would have ended a career immediately. Ronstadt's reaction, by all accounts, was one of shock and visible discomfort. The moment disrupted her performance and humiliated her in front of thousands of people. She did not respond by escalating the situation on stage. She finished what she could of the set and walked off with her professionalism intact, even if her composure had been rattled. Backstage, she said very little publicly. But the message sent to her team was unambiguous. She would not be performing anywhere near Morrison again. The incident might have faded into the general noise of 1960s rock excess had Morrison not made it worse. Weeks later, during a radio interview, he described Ronstadt as sweet but spineless and suggested her music lacked fire. Coming from one of the most commercially successful rock artists of that era, the comment carried real weight. It circulated in industry circles and landed exactly as it was intended to, as a dismissal of her credibility from a position of power. Ronstadt never responded publicly. What she did instead was more interesting. She became more deliberate about the environments she worked in, the artists she associated with, and the standards she held for professional conduct in her own orbit. Morrison died in Paris in 1971 at 27. His legacy in rock history is secure. But the way he treated Ronstadt stands as a reminder that brilliance and decency do not always arrive together. The relationship between Linda Ronstadt and Neil Young was never particularly close, but it was marked by a moment of public condescension that Ronstadt quietly carried with her for years afterward. The occasion was a politically charged benefit concert in 1976, organized in support of the United Farm Workers movement, a cause that both artists genuinely believed in. On paper, the event represented exactly the kind of cultural alignment that should have made for a powerful artistic partnership. What happened behind the scenes was something else entirely. Young, whose musical identity during this period was rooted in a raw, stripped-down urgency, made no effort to hide his disdain for Ronstadt's approach to the shared material. Her sound was polished, radio-friendly, and commercially refined, qualities that Young apparently interpreted as incompatible with the spirit of protest music. During rehearsals, he reportedly dismissed her suggestions, ignored her during group discussions, and made clear to others present that he considered her music too commercial and too clean for the occasion. The irony, which was not lost on people who knew Ronstadt well, was that her crossover appeal was precisely what gave causes like this one broader reach. A song that gets played on commercial radio reaches more people than a song that only resonates with those who already agree with the message. Ronstadt's polished platform was not a betrayal of the cause. It was potentially its most effective vehicle. Young either didn't see that or didn't care to. Ronstadt left that performance quietly deflated. She remained professional throughout, but those close to her noted the effect Young's dismissal had on her willingness to expose herself to similar situations. In subsequent years, she became more selective about the public events she participated in, and more careful about the dynamics at play before she committed her name and voice to any shared platform. She didn't stop being an activist. She simply stopped accepting disrespect as part of the cost of participation. Frank Zappa was not a man who made artistic collaborations comfortable. He was a perfectionist of the most uncompromising variety, someone who viewed his studio as an extension of his own mind and expected everyone inside it to subordinate their instincts to his vision. For musicians who thrived under that kind of authority, working with Zappa was a revelatory experience. For anyone who arrived with their own ideas and professional confidence, it was something considerably more difficult. Linda Ronstadt arrived at Zappa's studio in 1974 at the height of her commercial power. She had platinum records. She had sold-out tours. She had earned a reputation in the industry not just as a voice but as a serious artist with her own musical intelligence. She was interested in expanding her range and exploring sounds outside her established comfort zone. Zappa was allegedly looking for vocalists for a project that blended rock, jazz, and avant-garde composition. On the surface, the collaboration made a certain kind of sense. It collapsed almost immediately. When Ronstadt offered suggestions during the session, ideas about phrasing, vocal approach, arrangement, Zappa dismissed them openly, not in private conversation but in front of the other musicians present. A studio technician present during those sessions later recalled the atmosphere as deeply uncomfortable. Zappa was not simply steering the session in a different direction. He was publicly undermining a collaborator whose credentials were beyond question. Ronstadt walked out before the session concluded. She offered no dramatic statement, no confrontation, no public account of what had happened. The tapes from that session were shelved and never released. Zappa, in private conversations afterward, apparently framed the experience as evidence that pop artists couldn't handle serious music, a characterization so self-serving that it barely merits engagement. Ronstadt had not failed to keep up with Zappa's musical vision. She had simply refused to be treated as though her own artistic judgment was worthless. What the experience gave her, counterintuitively, was a sharper sense of the creative environment she actually wanted to build. In the years following the Zappa session, she took some of the most ambitious risks of her career, exploring big band arrangements, classical repertoire, and mariachi traditions, all on her own terms, in studios where collaboration meant something mutual. The Laurel Canyon music community of the early 1970s operated on an ethos of creative openness and artistic solidarity. Linda Ronstadt was a genuine participant in that world, present at sessions, supportive of fellow artists, willing to lend her voice and her reputation to collaborative projects that didn't always benefit her commercially. David Crosby was another fixture of that scene, and for a period, the two moved in genuinely friendly circles. The break, when it came, was swift and damaging. In 1975, during preparations for a benefit concert, Crosby proposed a key change for a group performance. Ronstadt declined, explaining that it didn't suit her vocal range. It was a straightforward, professional response, the kind that any working musician would understand immediately. Crosby apparently did not take it as such. Weeks later, he gave an interview to Rolling Stone in which he called Ronstadt's career manufactured, and implied that her success was a product of studio engineering rather than genuine artistic ability. The interview was not a private complaint. It was a public attack, published in the most widely read music magazine in the country, aimed at a fellow artist who had done nothing to deserve it beyond declining a key change. For Ronstadt, the cruelty of the timing and the venue was not lost. She responded by cutting ties, quietly but completely. She removed herself from a planned studio session that would have included Crosby, a decision that forced producers to rebuild the project's lineup from scratch. She stopped engaging with his work socially and professionally, and she never, in any public forum, returned fire. She simply disappeared from his orbit and let her subsequent work, her explorations of classical and Latin music, her expanding critical reputation, serve as the only answer she needed. Crosby's career during this same period was marked by serious personal struggles. His substance use was escalating, and his relationships, both personal and professional, were deteriorating. He later acknowledged in interviews that he had made significant mistakes during that time. He never issued a direct apology to Ronstadt, but the regret, when it came, was unmistakable. By then, Ronstadt had long since moved on.